Amara Lewis, a black CIA agent who had once risked her life to defend the nation, thought she would find peace in Brookdale. Instead, she became the target of those she had once protected, facing discrimination, insults, and relentless persecution simply because of the color of her skin. As the darkness of hatred rose, the one who had sown fear never imagined that this time justice would come for him first. Could Amara alone overturn the deep-rooted prejudice that had long poisoned this town? Where are you watching this video from? Write a comment below and help spread the journey for justice. I'm not trying to be prejudiced, but you should find another neighborhood. Someone like you doesn't belong here. The voice of a middle-aged man cut through the still night behind her, sharp as a cold blade. Amara Lewis froze by the tree-lined road of Brookdale, her hands gripping the strap of her backpack so tightly her knuckles turned white. The man, round-faced, streaks of gray in his hair, wearing a crumpled plumber's jacket, walked away without waiting for a response, leaving his shameless words hanging in the crisp early winter air. Amara drew a deep breath, as if she could swallow the humiliation burning in her chest. Brookdale, the town she had chosen, hoping to find a peaceful home after years of living amid gunfire and lies, was offering her a welcome she would never forget. Brookdale's main street still maintained its false order: white-painted wooden houses, neatly trimmed hedges, lampposts wrapped in wreaths. People greeted each other with polite smiles and exchanged a few words about the weather or the local football team. But as Amara passed by, the greetings fell silent, doors closed a little faster than usual, and the eyes, God, those eyes, sliced across her like blades against a skin she could never shed. She had thought that by shedding her combat gear and tucking away her CIA badge, she would be just another American citizen, a 34-year-old single woman who loved early morning runs and black coffee, a normal person among normal people. But Brookdale had quickly taught her that here, being black would never be normal. Amara Lewis had crossed the deadly deserts of the Middle East, crept through the shattered cities of Africa, and survived raids where death lurked behind every corner. She had dismantled plots that, had they succeeded, would have reduced towns like Brookdale to ash. She had fought without ever stopping to ask who would benefit from that freedom. She only knew it had to be protected. In return, she was met with suspicious glances, whispered slurs, and blunt words that struck like nameless bullets. Walking down the road toward home, a small wooden house she had just rented at the end of Maple Drive, Amara realized she had made a fundamental mistake, believing that loyalty and sacrifice were enough to erase the boundaries carved deep by history and prejudice across this country. Years of field work had taught her to read the smallest shifts: a glance, a slight frown, a subtle change in the air. Each one could signal danger. Now, that skill didn't help her spot car bombs or hidden traps in war-torn slums. It helped her sense that here, in these seemingly harmless homes, prejudice had sunk its roots deeper than any buried mine. And what hurt most was knowing that this time, the enemy didn't need to hide behind cloaks or code names. They wore khakis, sported Apple Watches, drove shiny SUVs, and looked at her as if her mere existence was an affront to the order they worshipped. Amara lifted her chin and quickened her pace. She knew she couldn't let their stares break her. She had survived gunfights, near-death missions, and unspoken wounds. A town steeped in ignorant prejudice would not bring her down. Yet, deep within, a slow, bitter ache began to rise. I used to think fighting for freedom would earn me acceptance, Amara thought. But here, even freedom has a color, and mine is the one they never let forget. She stopped before the small wooden gate of her house, fishing for her keys. A dog barked in the distance. A window across the street flicked its light on, only to snap off the moment she looked up. A cold wind swept past, rustling the brittle branches overhead. And then, from afar, the rumble of a car engine grew louder, creeping steadily closer. Headlights cut through the darkness, swallowing Amara's small figure in the bone-chilling stillness of the street. Brookdale at night was a heavy blanket of silence. Faint streetlights flickered, expensive SUVs rested motionless in their driveways, and rows of Cape Cod-style houses lined the streets. A picture officer, Kyle Reddick, had seen thousands of times over 10 years of patrol. 10 years of being stuck in the same battered cruiser, circling the same streets like a broken, looping record. As his car turned onto Maple Drive, Kyle's eyes caught the image of a lone figure standing before a small house, illuminated by the wavering glow of a streetlight. A black woman, so rare in this neighborhood, it was impossible not to notice, wearing a slung backpack, standing tall and showing no signs of panic or confusion even as the headlights beamed straight at her. Kyle felt his spine stiffen. For a moment, every training session, every protocol he'd learned seemed to dissolve, leaving only a primitive surge of unease, suspicion, and a vague, simmering anger. She stood there, too calmly, too confidently, as if she belonged, and that very assurance disturbed him in a way he couldn't quite explain, as if the natural order of this small world was being silently upended. He eased his cruiser to the curb, tires whispering against the cold asphalt. No siren, no flashing lights, just a slow, weighty approach, like an invisible hand pressing down on the woman's shoulder, forcing her to take notice. The car door creaked open, and Kyle stepped out, the weight of his utility belt making his movements heavier, more imposing. He stood there, hand relaxed near his waist, eyes locked onto her figure with the quiet calculation of a predator gauging distance to prey. "Out for a stroll this late?" Kyle said, dragging out each word, letting them fall like cold droplets on bare skin. Amara slowly turned to face him, the weak light casting long shadows beneath her feet. She did not flinch, did not appear alarmed, nor did she avert her gaze. Instead, she stood firm, her expression etched with a patience honed by years spent in places far more dangerous than this silent suburban street. "Good evening, officer," Amara replied, her voice low and steady, each syllable falling with the certainty of paving stones. "I'm just on my way home." Kyle arched an eyebrow, stepping closer, tilting his head slightly as if weighing invisible factors. Inside him, years of simmering discontent and deeply rooted biases roared to life. Someone like her didn't belong here. "Home?" he repeated, drawing the word out in the air like an unspoken accusation. "Do you live around here?" Amara nodded, her gaze neither confrontational nor submissive, merely a calm affirmation, and it was that very calmness that unsettled Kyle the most. "I'm renting the house at I-19 down the street," she said evenly, without a hint of panic. Kyle glanced at the keys in her hand, then scanned her up and down as if trying to find something, anything, out of place. A small imperfection he could seize upon to justify the vague distrust gnawing at him. Crossing his arms, he planted himself firmly between Amara and the gate, his broad shoulders deliberately blocking the narrow path. "We're not used to seeing unfamiliar faces around here this late," Kyle said, striving for a neutral tone, but the strain in his voice betrayed him. Amara caught every layer beneath his words. She had heard them her whole life. Unfamiliar didn't mean new, it meant black. No matter her citizenship, no matter her sacrifices for this country, in their eyes, she was always the outsider, the disruption to a fragile order built on silent prejudice. "I'm just trying to get home, officer," Amara said firmly, her hand still holding the keys without so much as a twitch. "I haven't done anything wrong." Kyle narrowed his eyes, the pupils tightening like a noose. "Show me some ID," he ordered, his voice hard as steel. Amara moved slowly, deliberately, every motion careful and measured, as if any sudden gesture might be misread as a threat. She retrieved her driver's license and a copy of her lease agreement. 2 small proofs that would decide how this night ended. Kyle snatched them, flipping them over, scrutinizing every detail. Everything checked out. Name, address, expiration dates, nothing amiss. But inside Kyle, the validation only deepened his irritation. Amara met his gaze, seeing the familiar struggle behind his eyes, the tug-of-war between undeniable facts and a stubborn instinct desperate to find fault. She had seen that look too many times, in too many places, from sprawling international airports to tiny forgettable police stations, the look that tried to twist reality to fit the contours of old prejudice. "Walking late at night isn't safe, you know," Kyle said, his tone heavy with implication. "Around here, we like things quiet. Strangers disturb the balance." Amara absorbed his words, feeling their cold sting. "I'm not a stranger to this country," she said, her voice soft as velvet but underlaid with steel. "I fought to protect it, even when people like me were never treated as full citizens." A flicker passed through Kyle's eyes, brief, almost imperceptible, before sinking back beneath the practiced mask of authority. He let out a dry grunt, stepping back slightly, still eyeing her as if she were a problem yet to be solved. "Just a security check," Kyle muttered, half to himself, half as if trying to justify it all. The gate of 119 Maple Drive was just within reach, but Amara Lewis knew she couldn't step through it just yet, because Officer Kyle Reddick's slow, deliberate footsteps dragged behind them a thick, suffocating tension, as if even the dim streetlights were shrinking back to make way for the unspoken interrogation swelling with every beat. "I'm sure you understand," Kyle said, his voice steady but dripping with barely concealed arrogance, "that not everyone around here appreciates new faces, especially after dark." The words floated out lightly, almost breezily, but Amara felt each hidden blade beneath the veneer of civility. He didn't have to say it outright, didn't need to wave a flag of prejudice, but the way he lingered on new faces, the way his gaze swept over her with open suspicion, said it all. Her skin was her crime. Amara turned to face him, the angle of the light casting deep shadows across her face, making her eyes seem even deeper, like a still lake hiding a storm underneath. "Fortunately, the law doesn't distinguish between old and new faces, officer," she replied, her voice calm but edged with a cutting clarity. "The only thing that matters is whether I've broken any laws." Kyle raised an eyebrow, his mouth twisting slightly as if challenged but struggling to find an immediate retort. The cruiser's lights behind him flickered, reflecting the growing impatience tightening his features. "You know," Kyle said with a cold chuckle, "we've had plenty of good folks move to Brookdale. Folks who know how to blend in, not draw attention." Amara caught every calculated pause, every silent shove, trying to force her back into the invisible wall society had built. People like her, if they didn't make themselves small and silent, would always be seen as a thorn. But Amara Lewis was not one to be pushed back easily. "Blending in doesn't mean disappearing, officer," she replied lightly, her lips curving into a faint smile. "I pay taxes like any other citizen. I have the right to enjoy a peaceful evening just like anyone else here. The attention I seem to attract, I'm afraid, says more about certain expectations than about my behavior." Kyle stiffened, her words slicing through the thin armor of authority he wore. Yet instead of retreating, he clung harder to the familiar script, the guardian of order, no matter how rotten that order might be. "It's just a security check," he repeated, his voice now tinged with a brittle sharpness. "We have to keep an eye on unusual activities. Public safety is our top priority." Amara stood silent for a moment, gripping the strap of her backpack, her gaze steady and unwavering. The gaze of someone who had faced real danger. Danger armed with guns, not uniforms and paperwork. "True safety," she said at last, her voice low and solid, "doesn't come from scrutinizing the innocent. It comes from understanding that existence itself doesn't require a special permit. If you care about safety, officer, you might want to start by laying down your prejudices. A cold gust swept through, making the gate creak against its hinges. Kyle's hand tightened reflexively around the grip of his holstered gun, not from fear of danger, but from the creeping realization that his sense of authority was being slowly eroded by the unwavering calm of the woman before him. "You should know," Kyle said, through gritted teeth, his eyes flashing with anger. "Cooperation makes everything a lot easier." Amara tilted her head slightly, as if pondering his words with genuine curiosity, before answering in a voice so gentle it burned like acid, "I am cooperating. I presented my documents. I answered your questions. I remained polite. If you need me to sing the national anthem or recite the Pledge of Allegiance to prove my loyalty, I can do that too. But I fear, for some, none of that will ever be enough to make me fit in." The silence between them grew thick and heavy. In the distance, porch lights flickered faintly, as if the very houses themselves wanted no part of the quiet battle unfolding on the sidewalk. Kyle hesitated, his lips pressed into a tight, bloodless line. Deep down, he knew she was right, and it was that truth that infuriated him most. Amara didn't wait any longer. She turned, unlocked the gate, and stepped through with a composure that treated Kyle as little more than a shadow behind her. She left in her wake a heavy void, another hairline crack in Brookdale's fragile mask of peacefulness, and inside her a thought echoed, sharp as a blade. In America, sometimes you don't have to do anything wrong to be questioned. You just have to be different. The wooden gate creaked softly under Amara's hand, and she had barely stepped into her yard when the sound of hurried footsteps slammed against the pavement behind her, a surge of angry energy rushing forward like a wave too powerful to hold back. "Stop!" Officer Kyle Reddick's voice rang out, harsher than any tone he had used before, raw with an anger he no longer bothered to hide. Amara tilted her head slightly, just enough to catch Kyle's figure in her peripheral vision. His body taut as a wire about to snap, his face flushed red under the sickly streetlights, and in his eyes, a dangerous glint, the kind that sparks when wounded pride turns into something uglier. "I didn't give you permission to leave," Kyle said, stepping closer, his voice low and metallic. "I need to search your backpack, now." Amara turned to face him fully, her hands calm before her chest, her backpack still slung over her shoulders. The cold night air whipped down the empty street, but inside her there was a deep, trained stillness, the kind honed through years spent surviving in places where death lurked in every breath. "I have presented valid identification," Amara answered, her voice steady, clear as a bell tolling through a fog. "I am under no obligation to consent to a personal search without probable cause, as protected by the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution." Kyle froze for the briefest moment, the words hitting the cracked surface of his authority like a hammer. But instead of stepping back, he pushed forward, his hand clenching into a fist by his side, his gaze burning with blind rage. "Only people hiding something hide behind constitutional rights," he sneered, the twisted smile on his lips cutting into the thickening air. Amara felt her blood pulse faster, but forced herself to remain composed, her eyes locking onto Kyle's with the focus of a veteran warrior refusing to take the bait. "Defending your rights isn't a crime," she said, each word sharpened like a blade, unwavering. "Unchecked authority is what should concern us." Kyle didn't reply with words. Instead, he lunged forward, reaching straight for her backpack with a rough, aggressive motion, abandoning any pretense of procedure or legality. Amara barely had time to register the sudden move. Her body reacted instinctively, slipping from his grasp with a fluid, efficient shoulder turn, a maneuver polished by training and necessity, shifting the dynamic from target to shield in less than a heartbeat. She didn't strike back, didn't escalate, just repositioned herself enough to throw Kyle off balance, leaving him awkwardly stumbling in the middle of her yard, his arm extended in a pathetic, grasping gesture of lost control. "Let go," Amara said quietly, her voice now honed to a cutting edge. "This is an unlawful use of force and an abuse of authority." Kyle's chest heaved, breath ragged, muscles taut like a cornered animal, the facade of professionalism shattered beyond repair. Yet before him, Amara stood firm, not trembling, not shouting, simply rooted like a lone marker standing against the full fury of a storm. The wind battered the porch, making her coat flap wildly, a flag of defiance against an enemy that wore a badge instead of a uniform of war. And in that moment, Kyle understood. This woman would not break easily. No excuse he conjured, no crumbling shard of power he clung to would bend her to his will. "I'm ordering you to surrender the backpack for inspection," Kyle hissed through clenched teeth, his hand twitching, ready to lunge again. "I refuse," Amara said, her voice cold and flat as the surface of a frozen lake. "Unless you have a search warrant or can demonstrate a specific threat, your request is invalid." They stood facing each other, a small physical space separating them, but between them stretched a chasm. On one side, the desperate aggression of power fueled by prejudice. On the other, the steady strength of dignity forged through countless trials. A light flickered in a neighbor's house across the street, but then blinked out, as if the watching eyes dared only to witness, never to intervene. Amara knew she could expect no help tonight, but she also knew she didn't need it. Her composure, her intelligence, and her courage would be her only weapons, and they would be enough to stand against a system eager to push her to the margins. Kyle stared at her a moment longer, then yanked his hand back abruptly, as if afraid his failure might be exposed too clearly. Without another word, he spun in his heel and stalked back toward the cruiser parked under the jaundiced streetlight, leaving Amara standing alone in the empty yard, her backpack still securely on her shoulders. Not a prize taken, but a symbol of the freedom she had just defended through her unbreakable will. Brookdale remained silent, but deep within it, a slow-burning fire of resentment had been lit, readying itself for the storms to come. As Kyle's figure receded, swallowed by the weak yellow light, Amara exhaled, her tense shoulders loosening at last. But barely a heartbeat later, she heard footsteps slicing violently through the quiet behind her, and then a sudden force crashing toward the back of her neck, fueled by pure, frenzied hatred. Instinct, honed through years of danger, exploded into motion faster than thought. Amara tilted aside at the last instant, her hand sweeping up like a bird in flight, catching Kyle's attacking wrist, twisting it smoothly, stepping aside to maintain distance without escalating further. A motion as light as wind, yet enough to make Kyle stumble, slipping awkwardly on the cold, slick path. "Don't make me hurt you," Amara said quietly, her eyes like sharpened steel, her hands lowered in a clear statement. She did not want, nor did she need, to use violence. But humiliation, being bested by a black woman, a stranger, fueled the wildfire of rage consuming Kyle from within. He staggered back, his face blazing red, his trembling hand snatching at the radio clipped to his belt, the click of the button sharp and brittle in the stillness. "Unit 31, this is Officer Reddick," Kyle hissed, his voice cracking with fury, requesting immediate backup at Maple Drive. "Female suspect, black, resisting and assaulting an officer. Repeat, suspect is attacking, requesting urgent assistance." The words spat from his mouth like blades, slicing away at the truth, flipping victim and aggressor in the space of a heartbeat, spinning a story he could control, or so he hoped, in the eyes of those about to arrive. Amara stood motionless in the center of her yard, her back straight, her shadow stretched long and resolute under the harsh glare of headlights. She knew that From this moment forward, the game had changed, and Brookdale would no longer be able to pretend it was a town of peaceful illusions. The distant wail of sirens tore through the night, the first cracks ripping apart Brookdale's fragile mask of peace. Red and blue lights flickered and danced across the pristine white walls of the neighborhood, making every roof and picket fence seem suddenly frantic, as if even the buildings understood that tonight the charade had reached its final breaking point. Amara stood in the center of her yard, arms relaxed at her sides, her gaze steady as the first patrol car screeched into view, tires shrieking against the cold asphalt. The door flung open, and two officers, a burly, gray-haired man and a young woman with tense, wide eyes, jumped out, hands already hovering near their holstered weapons, scanning the scene with quick, sharp movements. "Get on the ground. Hands on your head," the older officer barked, his voice split in the suffocating silence like a gunshot. Amara didn't move. She felt the harsh glare of headlights blinding her, heard the crackle of radios and the pounding footsteps closing in around her. Kyle lurked in the background, his face alight with a vicious satisfaction, confident that the story he had spun would be swallowed whole by those rushing onto the scene. Amara drew a slow, deliberate breath, the cold night wind slipping through the collar of her coat, chilling her skin like a whispered warning. If she chose silence, if she bowed her head now, everything she had ever fought to protect would be meaningless. "Hands on your head now," the young female officer shouted again, her voice trembling slightly as she drew her weapon, fear flashing openly in her eyes. Amara slowly raised her hands, not to surrender, but to retrieve something from inside her coat with calm precision, a small object sharp enough to flip the entire board in one move. She lifted a sleek black badge case, holding it up high and steady without the slightest hesitation. "Amara Lewis, Special Agent 341, Central Intelligence Agency," she said, her voice not loud but cutting through the chaos like a blade. "I am exercising my lawful right to self-defense. I demand you lower your weapons and verify my identity immediately." The world seemed to freeze. The wind stilled. The sirens receded into distant echoes. The blinding headlights continued to shine, but their power shifted. Now they merely illuminated a truth none of them had expected. The gray-haired officer froze, his hand slowly drifting away from his weapon, his eyes widening as if doused with ice water. The young woman hesitated, glancing at her partner in confusion, stepping back half a pace, her face pale under the flickering lights. Kyle stood, paralyzed, his mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping on dry land, the flush of anger draining into a sickly pallor. "She's lying," he stammered, his voice warped with panic. "She's just some vagrant." Amara didn't turn to acknowledge him. She held the badge firmly, her gaze locked on the senior officer, silently conveying that any rash move now would carry consequences far beyond what they could comprehend. The gray-haired officer, Lieutenant Jacobs, according to the faded name tag glinting under the harsh lights, pulled out his radio, his voice hoarse as he spoke into it. "Lieutenant Jacobs, Unit 4A. We have an individual claiming CIA Special Agent status, requesting immediate verification of badge number 3421, name Amara Lewis." The radio hissed and crackled with an urgent reply, but Amara didn't need to hear it to know. She trusted that the federal quick verification system would confirm her identity in less than 30 seconds. Time stretched into scattered, disjointed beats across the small town. Hidden behind darkened windows, unseen eyes watched every movement, gripped by a mix of fear and fascination. And then the reply came, short and sharp as a blade slicing through Kyle's carefully crafted lies. "Confirmed. Special Agent Amara Lewis, CIA. Active status. Non-interference advised." A heavy silence fell. Lieutenant Jacobs lowered his radio, his face drawn tight with discomfort as he glanced at Amara, then at Kyle, suspicion and anger flickering across his weathered features. Amara lowered her badge, her eyes now reflecting a steady, heavy light, not the light of victory, but of someone who had fought too many battles without ever expecting fairness. "I request the immediate withdrawal of all accusations," she said, her voice unwavering, "and a full incident report on Officer Reddick's misconduct." Kyle opened his mouth to protest, but under the crushing weight of exposed truth, all that came out was a strangled mumble. Amara turned her head, her gaze sweeping over the silent houses, the dark streets, then back to the officers standing frozen before her. People who, only minutes ago, had aimed their weapons at her based solely on a lie. The atmosphere in Brookdale had shifted permanently. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was thick with shame, confusion, and an unspoken fear that would linger long after the sirens faded. Amara tightened her grip on her backpack, feeling not just its physical weight, but the burden of her skin, her identity, and the long, brutal history she carried every day. The night wind in Brookdale still whispered through the bare trees, carrying with it a chill and the murmurs of things unspoken. In the yard of 119 Maple Drive, the harsh glow of headlights had softened, and the eyes behind the windshield now flickered with confusion and hesitation, as if even those in uniform no longer knew where justice ended and humiliation began. Lieutenant Jacobs gripped his radio tightly, his face hardened under the flashing red and blue lights. He took a deep breath, gathering the battered remnants of a man who once believed he was serving what was right, and spoke in a heavy, reluctant voice. "Officer Reddick, as of this moment you are suspended pending internal investigation. Hand over your weapon and badge immediately." The declaration fell onto Brookdale's soil like a heavy stone, shaking the rotten foundations of silent complicity that had long been buried beneath its quaint surface. Kyle froze for a moment before rage exploded across his body. His hand trembled as he ripped the badge from his chest, the motion so violent it sent buttons flying, then drew his service weapon and slammed it onto the cruiser's hood with a force that was more a final, desperate assertion of authority than anything else. His bloodshot eyes swept across the small gathering behind him, now beginning to disperse, and then locked onto Amara, the small, unyielding woman standing upright among the patrol cars, carrying not just a heavy backpack, but the silent defiance against a system he had always assumed would shield him. No apology, no sign of remorse, only a glare, thick with hatred, like a wounded animal nursing its grudges deep in the shadows. Amara met his gaze without flinching. She didn't need to defeat him at this moment. She understood that men like Kyle didn't retreat because of a single loss. They withdrew. They swallowed their humiliation like a silent oath, and they found new places to sow their hate, just as rotten roots continued to spread beneath seemingly healthy soil. Kyle turned without a word and stalked toward the waiting vehicle, each step trampling the tatters of his shattered pride deeper into the dirt. Amara watched him go, not triumphantly, but with a solemn light in her dark eyes, the kind of light carried by someone who knew that no single victory, no matter how resounding, could cleanse a forest that had long since rotted at its roots. The cruiser rumbled to life, disappearing behind the trees, leaving behind a heavy, strained silence as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, too afraid to ask, too afraid to understand what had truly just unfolded. Lieutenant Jacobs approached, giving Amara a small, awkward nod, his face a mixture of shame and reluctant respect. "We'll be filing an incident report," he said, his voice softer now, stripped of the authority it once held, "and forwarding everything to internal affairs in the federal agencies." Amara simply nodded, offering no words in return. She knew that report would be drafted in cold, clinical language, choking out every emotion, every injustice she had endured second by second tonight. The false accusations, the suspicious glances, the shouted commands in her yard would all be sanitized into a handful of sterile lines labeled incident, because that was how the system protected itself, not with truth, but by making the pain invisible. Tightening her grip on her backpack, Amara walked slowly toward the front door, her boots striking the cold ground with dry, solitary thuds, steady but never hesitant. Behind her, the patrol cars switched off their lights one by one, doors slammed shut, and Brookdale slipped back into its preferred state of artificial calm, as if tonight's upheaval was nothing more than a ripple on the surface of its stagnant pond. She opened the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind her with a quiet, firm click. In the warm darkness of her small home, Amara leaned against the wall and closed her eyes, feeling her heartbeat gradually slow, her breaths still tinged with the sharp salt of vigilance. She knew that tonight's battle, ending with Kyle's suspension, was merely a small, fragile victory, thin as morning mist. The roots of the problem, the ingrained prejudice, the whispered slanders, the silent collusion, remained untouched, flourishing beneath the rotten soil of society. One battle won could not heal a forest long since poisoned. Amara Lewis, bearing the invisible scars of tonight's fight, understood that better than anyone, and she also knew the road ahead would be long, cold, and filled with many sleepless nights. But, like any true warrior, she would never back down. The next morning, Brookdale once again cloaked itself in its familiar facade of peace, as if the night before had never happened, as if nothing had ever threatened to knock its carefully curated world off balance. The morning wind was sharp, gliding through the skeletal branches and rattling the welcome to the holiday signs hanging from porch rails with a hollow, lifeless clatter. Amara sat at the small kitchen table, her coffee cooling in her hands, her gaze drifting beyond the window to the soft mist clinging to the streets. Everything in the town hubbed as usual. Small delivery trucks rumbled down Main Street, children pedaled toward school with backpacks bouncing behind them, and somewhere the church bells rang out a heavy, dull chime that failed to wash away the oppressive weight settling over her. Then came a knock at the door. A single knock, short and brittle, then silence. Amara set her cup down and stepped onto the porch. There, lying awkwardly on the step, was a white envelope. No return address, no markings except for a few savage red letters scrawled with desperate violence. Get out. The early breeze stirred, making the paper shiver like a whispered threat. Amara stooped, picked up the envelope, feeling her fingers tighten for a moment before she calmly tore through the crude paper. Inside, a folded sheet bore a message, printed in angry, blood-red ink. You don't belong here. Leave before it's too late. No signature, no greeting. Only the raw, exposed hatred of a place where, beneath every sermon and every banner of unity, wild and grotesque cracks still ran deep. Amara inhaled slowly, letting the chill fill her lungs, then lifted her eyes to the gate at the front of her yard. And there it was, a new message, spray-painted in thick, furious red across the wood. You will regret it. The paint was still wet, droplets sliding down the wood like fresh wounds that refused to scab over. She turned her head slightly, scanning the surroundings. The windows stayed shut. Curtains stirred and quickly snapped closed. No one stepped out. No one asked if she was all right. Not a word of concern. Not even a glance of shared outrage. Only a heavy silence clinging to the air like thick fog pressing down on every breath. Amara descended the steps, moving toward the vandalized gate. Each footfall echoed against the dew-slick cement, a lonely rhythm against the town's brittle pretense of calm. She knew. She had known the moment Kyle had driven away with hatred burning in his eyes that it wouldn't end there. Men like him were never alone. They were the offspring of a whole system, nurtured and sheltered by a silent, complicit community. Her fingertips brushed the gate, smearing the wet paint onto her cold skin, and a chill rippled through her. Not fear, but the raw coldness of betrayal and the sharp sting of utter isolation. I live among polite smiles and malicious silence, she thought bitterly. Here, in this pristine, neatly wrapped town, under wreath-draped porches and candy-cane-striped lampposts, she, a citizen, a soldier, who had once vowed to protect her nation, a warrior who had bled unseen in distant lands, had become the outsider, forced to measure every step, every breath. Amara let her hand fall from the gate, allowing the red paint to drip into the misty dawn. She turned and walked back toward the house, closing the door firmly behind her. Inside, the little home was dark except for the restless light bleeding in from the porch. She leaned against the wooden door, closing her eyes, letting the darkness soothe the invisible scratches clawed across her soul. One small victory could not change a forest rotted at its core. Amara knew this. She knew she had crossed a threshold last night into a larger war, a war fought not against bullets and fists, but against sidelong glances, hollow greetings, and empty platitudes about peace. Brookdale could choose to look away, but Amara Lewis would not. She straightened, lifting her head high, and reminded herself once more, you don't fight to be accepted. You fight to exist. You fight to carve out every scrap of justice with courage and relentless endurance, even if you have to walk the road alone, even if the path ahead is shrouded in cold and darkness. She would not back down. Afternoon settled over Brookdale in a cold, pale light, stretching long gray shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns and silent walls of the town. In her small kitchen, Amara sat by the window, eyes tracing the fading letters on the gate where "You will regret." It was beginning to peel away under a thin mist of rain. The red paint, though smudged and cracked, still screamed defiance, a declaration that needed no disguise. Amara cradled a cup of cold tea in her hands, her chest heavy. She had grown unused to loneliness on missions, had long learned to rely solely on herself in enemy territory, but never before, on her soil, had she felt isolation so profound. A knock came at the door, soft, hesitant, more a plea for permission than a demand. Amara rose, hesitated briefly with her hand on the doorknob, then turned it. On her porch stood a middle-aged couple pressed close together, as if bolstering each other's courage. The man, in his 50s, his hair peppered with gray, bore a rugged face that nonetheless flickered with guilt. The woman, smaller, with her blonde hair tied back neatly, clutched his hand tightly as though drawing strength from the contact. "Good afternoon, Miss Lewis," the man said first, his voice roughened by tension. "We're the Carters. We live across the street." Amara tilted her head slightly, not stepping aside to invite them in, her gaze steady, measured, watchful. The woman interjected, her voice shaken slightly in the cold air. "We saw what happened last night. We saw everything this morning, too." A taut silence followed. The wind stirred again, carrying the damp, bitter scent of wet earth and peeling paint. Last night, Mr. Carter drew a deep breath, meeting Amara's eyes without flinching. We stayed silent. We saw how that officer treated you, saw you surrounded, saw the injustice laid bare. But we did nothing. We were afraid. Amara regarded them, feeling a tangle of emotions stir inside her. Anger, sorrow, understanding. She did not hate them. She understood the deep, instinctive fear of standing alone, the terror of being dragged into someone else's storm. "I understand," she said softly, her voice tempered by a quiet grace. "No," Mrs. Carter said, her voice firm despite its trembling, her eyes shining with an earnest, raw resolve. "No, you shouldn't have to understand. No one should have to fight alone because the rest of us are too afraid to act." A gust rattled the holiday sign across their porch, the hollow clatter echoing the brittle silence. Mr. Carter squeezed his wife's hand tighter and straightened his shoulders. "We're here because we don't want to stay silent anymore. What happened to you was wrong. The threats, they're the ugly, festering rot of hatred. And if you need us, we're willing to testify. In court, in front of anyone, whenever you need it. Amara felt her chest tighten, not with grief, but with a fragile warmth she had not expected to feel again. A flickering trust in the quiet courage of ordinary people. "Why?" she asked, the question escaping in a breath that carried with it oceans of bruised hope and cautious disbelief. Mrs. Carter stepped forward, her eyes shimmering under the fading afternoon light. "Because last night we saw the truth," she said, each word trembling but firm. "And today we realize that if we keep turning away, we become part of the very evil we fear. You stood alone for what was right. It's time we did too." Amara nodded slowly, pressing her lips together to hold back the swell of emotion. In her heart, a tiny, stubborn flame began to flicker, burning through the dense fog of bitterness and doubt. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick but steady. "But you should know, once you step forward you'll become targets too. Here, justice isn't welcome, Machian." Carter offered a grim small smile. "We know, but justice doesn't need to be welcome. It just needs people brave enough to chase it." Amara looked at them, the white couple who had chosen to step out from the safety of silence, willing to pay the price to stand with what was right, and she understood, no matter how long, how cold, how lonely the road ahead would be, she would not walk it entirely alone. In that moment, amid the lingering chill and the gray gloom of Brookdale, a fragile but undeniable light broke through, not blinding, not loud, but enough to kindle hope. Hope that even buried under layers of silence and fear, justice could rise again, sparked by the simplest promise: you won't have to fight alone. Afternoon settled over Brookdale in a pale, sickly light, casting lazy, blurred shadows across the empty streets where ornamental windmills turned sluggishly in the breeze and slowed down. Children at play signs swung crookedly from street lamps. Amara stepped out of her house, her heart a little lighter after speaking with the Carters, though a persistent heaviness still smoldered deep inside, like walking across a landscape where every patch of ground might conceal a trap. But she knew that if she let fear shrink her, she would lose the very thing that had kept her alive for so long, her faith in human dignity. She slipped in her earbuds and strolled down the cracked sidewalk, her mind quietly running through contingency plans for the days ahead, aware of the cold, silent gazes trailing her every step. Then, a scream tore through the stillness. "Watch out!" Amara snapped her head up, her eyes scanning the street, and in that split second, everything slowed. A little girl, blonde, in a pink dress, no older than 7, was darting across the road, clutching a broken doll, oblivious to the silver pickup truck barreling around the corner at deadly speed. The driver, a young man with dark glasses, was hunched over his phone, unaware of the small figure in his path. No one on the sidewalk moved. No cry was fast enough to halt what was coming. Only Amara. Without thinking, without analyzing, instinct from years of life or death training flared through her body. She lunged off the curb, a missile launched by pure will, sprinting into the street. In a blink, she scooped up the girl, twisting her body to shield the child, and rolled them both onto the far sidewalk. The pickup screeched past with a burning stench of rubber, missing them by mere inches, its momentum rattling the air around them. Heart pounding, Amara held the child tightly, feeling her sweat chill against her skin. Slowly, she loosened her grip, checking for injuries. Only a minor scrape on the elbow, nothing more. The little girl, wide-eyed and gasping, stared up at her in stunned silence. "You're safe now," Amara murmured, gently brushing blonde hair from the girl's forehead. Footsteps pounded the pavement behind them. A middle-aged woman sprinted toward them, hair disheveled, face ashen with terror. Amara recognized her instantly. Rebecca Johnson, the woman who had so often passed her in the supermarket without a glance, whose icy stare had once sliced through her in community meetings as if Amara were a stain she refused to acknowledge. "Savannah!" Rebecca cried, collapsing around the child, clutching her so tightly it seemed she wanted to absorb her daughter into her very being. Amara stepped back, giving them space, silent and unseen once more. Rebecca rocked Savannah in her arms, whispering frantic reassurances. Finally, she looked up, and for the first time, her eyes truly met Amara's. In that fleeting instant, the invisible walls that had stood between them, between white and black, between accepted and outsider, stood stark and naked, powerless to shield her from the truth. "Miss Lewis, Rebecca began, her voice faltering under the weight of shame and gratitude. Thank you for saving Savannah." Amara simply nodded, not seeking thanks, not needing recognition. To her, it had been an instinct, a human response, not a performance for praise. But Rebecca didn't stop there. She set Savannah gently down, then reached out, taking Amara's hand in both of hers, the same hand she might once have recoiled from touching, and said through choked tears, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for the way I looked at you before, for thinking you didn't belong here." The sun dipped behind the low rooftops of Brookdale, painting the world in streaks of crimson and gold. Amara glanced down at Savannah's small hand, still wrapped around her fingers, her bright blue eyes filled with innocence, untainted by prejudice or old grudges, and Amara smiled, a sad, fierce smile, like the last blaze of sunlight before nightfall. "None of us truly belongs anywhere, Mrs. Johnson," she said quietly. "We can only learn to stay together." Rebecca nodded, tears catching in the fading light. Amara understood then. Real change didn't come from grand declarations or thunderous protests. Change grew from small moments like this, fragile, slow, almost imperceptible. It came when a child's life was saved, when a real apology, humble and sincere, broke free from pride's grasp. It came when one heart, even for a moment, chose connection over division. The heart didn't see color. Society had, and still did, build walls of separation. But if a mother could see a woman first, not her skin, then perhaps, just perhaps, hope remained. And Amara Lewis, standing there amid the bubbling laughter of a saved child and the tearful gratitude of a changed heart, knew this. Though the road ahead would be long and lonely, each step she took was planting seeds for a different tomorrow. Night fell over Brookdale like a thick, suffocating shroud, slowly swallowing rooftops and street corners into silence. The few yellow lights flickering from windows scattered across the town glowed like isolated embers struggling against the tightening darkness. Amara sat quietly in her small kitchen, bathed in the faint, worn halo of an old desk lamp. In front of her, her laptop screen glowed in the dimness, casting its pale light across her deep brown eyes, dark and still as a hidden lake concealing the storm beneath. The conversation with the Carters still lingered in her mind, a rare moment of awakening, fragile but sincere. But Amara knew too well. A thank you, a word of apology, no matter how genuine, would not dismantle the deep, dangerous currents running under every brick and sidewalk of Brookdale. She needed to know more, not just to protect herself, but to confront the system that had spawned men like Kyle Reddick, the cold stares, the venomous letters. Amara logged into an internal intelligence portal, her fingers dancing over the keys with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating a world where truth was always buried beneath layers of carefully crafted lies. Kyle Reddick's file surfaced with a few strokes. Born and raised in Brookdale, second son of a military family, father a former National Guard officer, mother a community nurse. Kyle attended the State Police Academy, graduated with average marks, and carried a handful of minor disciplinary incidents, all neatly handled internally. Amara's brow furrowed as she dug deeper into the file. Then, under family, one name leapt out at her: Staff Sergeant Noah Reddick, Kyle's older brother, a veteran who had served in Afghanistan. Her heart skipped a beat. Quickly, Amara launched another search, flipping through old mission archives. When the results flashed across the screen, she sat back, stunned, bitter laughter bubbling somewhere deep inside her chest. 5 years ago, during a brutal rescue operation in Kunduz, Afghanistan, Amara had helped extract a group of American civilians trapped in heavy crossfire. And among the rescued that day, highlighted clearly in the cold typeface, was Noah Reddick. Noah, the brother of Kyle, the same Kyle who had seen her as nothing but a threat, a stain, because of the skin she wore. Amara leaned back in her chair, exhaling a slow, heavy breath. She remembered that mission, the stench of gunpowder clinging to the air, the screams swallowed by mortar fire pounding the earth, the desperate, terrified faces clinging to one another in the dark, praying for a miracle. After his rescue, for 3 years straight, Noah Reddick had sent Christmas cards to the CIA, thanking the unknown female agent who had risked her life to save his. Every card contained the same line: "I don't know who you are, but I wish you peace every Christmas, because without you, I wouldn't be alive to hold my daughter." Amara smiled bitterly, a hollow, aching smile. She had risked everything to bring the Reddick family back together, to ensure a brother would return home, to parents, to a little girl waiting for her father's arms. And yet, here in Brookdale, the younger Reddick had looked at her with suspicion, with hate, blind to the life she had helped save, blind to the humanity she shared, all because of the color of her skin. Amara closed her eyes, letting the flood of emotions wash through her. Sorrow, rage, a bone-deep weariness that no amount of resilience could fully shield against. Somewhere, people still clung to the belief that freedom, equality, and gratitude were sacred, immutable values. But here, in this small town, a harsher truth had been carved into the bones of daily life. Skin color could erase even the greatest debts. Skin color could turn a savior into a suspect. She opened her eyes again, staring into the glowing screen as if it were reflecting every shattered piece of a dream she had carried for so long. The dream of a justice that knew no color. A justice she had fought and bled for across continents. A dream crushed under the weight of inherited ignorance, passed from one generation to the next like a poison. But Amara also knew, if she surrendered that dream, if she allowed skin color to define worth, then everything she had fought for, every drop of blood, every moment standing alone under enemy fire, would mean nothing. She shut down the laptop, rose from her chair, her shoulders sagging slightly under an invisible burden. Yet, in her eyes, the embers of defiance reignited, quiet, steady, but strong enough to face even a forest rotten to its roots. She would fight, not for applause, not for validation, but because deep within her she still believed justice had no color. Justice demanded protection with a fierceness that didn't dim, even when hope flickered low, even if she had to walk forward alone through the thickest darkness. While Amara Lewis sat by her small window, grappling with the bitter irony life had dealt her, not far away, in the damp shadows of a crumbling roadside bar, something even more dangerous than Brookdale's silent hostility was taking root: organized hatred. Kyle Reddick, hunched at a corner of the bar, his head low under a battered baseball cap, the dim yellow light casting angry shadows across his flushed face, burning with rage and humiliation. Around him, thick-armed, tattooed men reeking of cheap beer exchanged hushed, broken fragments of conversation heavy with scorn. Freeloaders, invaders, taking our country. Kyle nodded along, drinking in each slur as if it were black fuel pouring into his veins, feeding him the twisted validation he craved. The man leading the group, a bearded brute with eyes sharp as razors, leaned toward Kyle, his voice low and slicing each word with precision. "You said she's CIA?" Kyle nodded, his hand clenching a plastic beer cup so tightly it crumpled under his fingers. "She thinks she's untouchable," he growled, voice trembling with a fury he could barely contain. "Flashing that badge around like she owns the place, but I swear she'll learn who runs this town." The bearded man narrowed his eyes, then smiled a cold, predatory smile, as if Kyle had just sung exactly the tune he'd been waiting for. "You've come to the right place." Their group, calling themselves the Sovereign Guard, had long infected small towns like Brookdale, where manicured lawns and spotless white walls masked the rot festering beneath. They claimed to defend order, traditional values, purity, but beneath their noble disguises, only fear and hatred thrived. Kyle, humiliated by a black woman in front of his peers, needed no convincing. He had been ready for this, just waiting for someone to hand him a cause he could wrap his vengeance in. "We'll make their part of a town look like a war zone," the bearded man said, his smile widening like a wound. "Burn a few cars, smash some shop windows, tag their buildings. Make sure when the authorities show up, they see those people as the real problem." Kyle swallowed hard, feeling a hot surge of excitement pulse through him. This was it. Punishment, retribution, a way to remind people like Amara Lewis that they would never truly belong, never be welcome. They sketched out their plan on a crumpled napkin. Targets, timings, coded symbols for communication. Everything calculated carefully. No obvious fingerprints, no lethal violence, just enough damage to spread fear, just enough chaos to reinforce the narrative that the different ones were the root of all disorder. Kyle left the bar close to midnight, a waterproofed copy of the plan tucked securely in his jacket. The skies over Brookdale had turned heavy and low, thick with black clouds pressing down on the rooftops, as if the very air was bracing for an oncoming storm. He looked up at the sleeping streets, at the flickering porch lights, at the American flags swaying softly in the night breeze. A twisted smile curled on his lips. "Keep believing this country belongs to everyone," he muttered. "Tomorrow, we'll remind you who owns this town." And so, under the false banner of defending order, a plan of hatred was set into motion at the heart of Brookdale. Quiet, meticulous, and terrifyingly real. The next day, Brookdale gleamed with a polished, almost unnatural calm, as if someone had wiped clean its surface to hide the cracks beneath. But Amara Lewis, with years spent treading enemy grounds, knew too well. When peace was too pristine, it was only a thin layer hiding a brewing storm below. She sensed it immediately upon stepping into the Brookdale Police Department, the place that was supposed to stand as a fortress for order and justice. In the small meeting room, fluorescent lights cast uneven shadows, bright and dim patches rippling across the space like a room trying, and failing, to conceal the fractures tearing through it. Officers, clad in navy uniforms, sworn to uphold justice, now silently divided into invisible factions. Amara watched quietly. Every glance, every tightened brow, every subtle nod, and understood that the split could no longer be hidden. Lieutenant Davis, a man with a reputation for integrity, struggled to keep the meeting from descending into chaos. He spoke about preserving the department's image, about addressing abuses of authority firmly, and emphasized, no one is above the law, uniform or not. But his words fell into the room like pebbles tossed into stagnant water, causing surface ripples yet leaving the thick, murky depths untouched. Across from him, Sergeant Miller, a middle-aged man with a meticulously trimmed mustache and eyes sharp with suspicion, crossed his arms and shook his head subtly. When Davis finished, Miller's voice cut through the room, low but clear enough for everyone to hear. Everyone here knows Kyle Reddick. He might be hot-headed, but if he hadn't been the one on patrol that night, things could have gotten worse. I don't condone overstepping, but sometimes you gotta be firm to keep the peace. A silent wave of nods rippled across a few officers, young ones, familiar faces Amara had glimpsed during late-night patrols. No one said it outright, but Amara felt the undercurrent clearly. To them, Kyle wasn't the real problem. It was people like her, those who didn't belong but dared to challenge a white officer, who were the true irritation. She kept her face still, her dark eyes betraying none of the fire simmering beneath her composed exterior. Not everyone in uniform served justice. It was a truth Amara had learned early in her career, but seeing it laid so bare still wrenched her heart. Lieutenant Davis gripped the folder in his hands tightly, his gaze sweeping the room, reading the silent dissent. His voice dropped, colder, sharper. Anyone who supports abuses of power, anyone covering for misconduct is positioning themselves against the law itself. There is no gray area here. You either stand with justice, or you stand against it. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating the room. Amara sat unmoving, feeling each heartbeat in her chest. She knew Davis was fighting to hold the line, but the weight of old prejudices, the invisible ties of fear and self-interest, wouldn't be broken by speeches alone. When the meeting finally broke, she rose quietly, pulling her thin jacket closer around her shoulders to deflect the glances, some evasive, some cold, some openly defiant. Out in the hallway, Amara paused, leaning lightly against the wall, exhaling a slow breath. She wasn't entirely alone. There were still a few younger officers whose fleeting, uncertain looks hinted at hesitation, at hope. There were people like Davis, like the Carters. But she knew that, from now on, the fight wouldn't just be against Kyle and the Sovereign Guard. It would also mean battling the silent, corroding forces within the very place meant to stand guard over justice. In her mind, those cold, unflinching faces merged into a towering wall blocking the road ahead. But then, she remembered Savannah, the blonde child clutching her doll, trusting her without question, and Amara knew she couldn't turn away. She tightened the strap of her backpack and stepped out into the fading afternoon light. The cold wind whipped through the streets, carrying the clatter of flagpoles and the distant scent of wood smoke. Ahead of her, Brookdale lay under its familiar, deceitful calm. But Amara knew the real storm was coming, and she was ready to meet it, armed with the courage of someone who had sworn to fight for justice, even if it meant standing alone against a decaying world. Brookdale sank into the night like a glass dome lowered over it. On the surface, clear and serene, but beneath, dark waters churned violently, swirling with plots the town's peaceful facade would never betray. Amara Lewis sat in her small kitchen, the glow of her laptop casting shifting light and shadow across her face. On the screen, satellite maps and decoded radio frequencies flashed by, tools she once wielded against insurgents in foreign lands, now deployed to defend a town she had dared to call home. The previous night, while inspecting her home security systems, Amara had picked up an odd radio transmission, one not belonging to official police channels or civilian frequencies. Her instincts sharpened immediately. Tracing it, extracting it, decoding it, all led to one chilling discovery: a detailed plan for orchestrated violence. A plan targeting black-owned businesses, immigrant-run stores, local churches, and even white families seen as traitors for support inequality. Maps of intended attacks, timed operations, lists of targets. It was all there, meticulously laid out, prepared by the Sovereign Guard and coordinated with Kyle Reddick like a grim military campaign. They didn't just want chaos, they wanted fear. They wanted to fracture the town along the fault lines of suspicion and difference, to stoke panic until they could emerge as self-proclaimed saviors, demanding obedience at the cost of freedom and dignity. Amara's fists clenched at her sides. She had seen these tactics before. In Fallujah, in Kabul, in cities where hatred ripped societies apart. She would not, could not, let it happen here. Not on American soil. Not in the community she had fought so hard to protect. Without hesitation, Amara compiled all the data, encrypted it, and reached out to Lieutenant Davis, the one man in the Brookdale Police Department she trusted. They met quietly in the break room, beneath the whir of an aging ceiling fan and the cold buzz of neon lights. Davis listened intently to Amara's report, his face darkening with each piece of the puzzle falling into place. "My God," he murmured, running a trembling hand through his graying hair. "If they pull this off, the whole town will tear itself apart, and they'll have the excuse they need to brand anyone different as a threat." Amara nodded, her gaze fixed firmly on him, searching for any sign of hesitation. "How many can we trust?" she asked, voice low but steady. Davis inhaled sharply, glancing at the personnel board pinned to the wall. Several names, officers who had subtly backed Kyle in the recent meeting, were immediately crossed off any plan of action. "Not many," he admitted grimly, "but enough to do what's right." And so, in that small, dim room, a quiet alliance formed, those willing to stand for justice, knowing full well that the coming battle would not be fought merely between good and evil, but between fragile hope and roaring hatred. That night, Brookdale stirred uneasily. From the outskirts of town, shadowy figures crept toward the center, trucks laden with gas cans, rags, makeshift weapons, and spray paint. They moved in small clusters like a black tide, clear in their intent to unleash fear before dawn. But what they hadn't expected was that this time, darkness had been met head-on. Hidden in alleyways, beneath porch awnings, tucked into the blind spots of the town, Amara and the loyal officers lay in wait. She wore an earpiece, pressed close against the cool brick, her hand firm around her sidearm, her heartbeat steady as a war drum. Over their secured channel, commands came swift and sure. "North Team, hold position. South Team, block the intersections. Wait for the signal." Through her thermal binoculars, Amara tracked a group of Sovereign Guard members as they approached the Gomez family's grocery store, one of the many immigrant businesses targeted for destruction. The instant she saw the flash of fire ignite, she gave the signal. Chaos erupted. Shouts split the night as officers surged from the shadows, overwhelming the would-be arsonists with brutal efficiency. Amara herself tackled the ringleader from the northern flank, a heavy-set man with sleeves of tattoos, pinning his arms behind his back before he could draw his homemade weapon. Others scattered in panic, but they were swiftly rounded up, cold steel cuffs snapping shut around wrists. Screams and curses echoed through the streets, but they fell into the uncaring night air. When the dust settled, Brookdale still reeked of smoke. Flashing lights painted the streets red and blue, and the lingering hum of sirens filled the air. But no innocent lives had been lost. Amara stood in the middle of the street, her back damp with sweat, her eyes sharp and unwavering. Across from her, the Johnson family, who once barely acknowledged her presence, now clung to one another, their faces etched with raw, unspoken gratitude, their store untouched. Others, who once turned away in silence, now looked at her differently, not with fear or dismissal, but with something closer to respect. Amara didn't smile. This wasn't a victory to celebrate. It wasn't forgiveness earned. It was simply duty fulfilled, the defense of fragile decency in a world far too willing to surrender to hate. The first pale rays of dawn stretched across Brookdale's streets, still heavy with mist and the lingering stench of last night's smoldering chaos. Police cars crowded every intersection, and strips of yellow crime scene, do not cross tape, wrapped around blocks like open wounds, grim reminders that even in the smallest, seemingly peaceful towns, hatred could grow and ignite, if not swiftly crushed. Amara Lewis stood silently in the police department parking lot, a dark windbreaker draped over her shoulders, her gaze steady and cold as she watched the group being led out from the interrogation rooms. Kyle Reddick, once a man who wore the badge of law enforcement, now shuffled forward in handcuffs, his face bruised from futile resistance, his clothes stained and tattered, like his career, like his soul. He walked between two officers, no longer the commanding figure he had once imagined himself to be, but a man stripped bare by his own blind choices and seething hatred. Yet Kyle did not bow his head. He kept it lifted high, defiant, his eyes crackling with rage and venom, a cornered animal still trying to snarl, still clinging to its broken pride. As his gaze swept the crowd gathered outside the station, Brookdale's townsfolk, dazed and uneasy in the morning gloom, Kyle paused, lips curling into a final venomous sneer. "Traitor!" he roared, voice raw and ragged with hatred. "You think you've won, you black bitch? You'll never belong here, never!" The entire parking lot seemed to freeze at that moment. Kyle's poisoned words rang out in the cold air, barbed and aimed straight at Amara, desperate to pierce her final defenses. But Amara Lewis didn't move. She stood rooted, a statue of tempered steel, her face betraying neither anger nor even the slightest tremor in the face of his filth. She met his eyes, not with fury, but with a calm so deep it stripped the insult of all its power. She saw through him, through the shattered mask, through the crumbling facade of righteous anger, to the small, frightened man hiding beneath. Her silence hit harder than any retort could have. It was a blow to Kyle's rotting spirit, a reminder that his hatred was powerless against her dignity. He staggered, as if struck by an invisible force. He screamed again, an animal's broken howl, but now it echoed hollow and meaningless across the empty lot. Kyle Reddick, once a symbol of misguided pride, once the misplaced hope of his family and town, was loaded into the prison van, a living warning that a badge could never make a man righteous, and hatred could never stay hidden beneath the thin skin of law and order forever. Amara stood still for a long time after the prison van door slammed shut behind Kyle Reddick. That dry, final sound echoed inside her, like the last shattering of an illusion America had clung to for so long, that justice, draped in a uniform and a flag, was enough to make it pure. She looked at the residents of Brookdale, some quietly turning away, some nodding at her with a belated acknowledgement, but most wearing that hesitant, wary look, as if unsure they could trust what they had just witnessed. In that moment, Amara felt a deep, slow-burning sorrow, not for Kyle, the man who had sown hatred, but for a far more bitter truth. For centuries, countless people of color had been conditioned to believe that the injustices they endured were somehow their fault, that if they just tried a little harder, stayed a little quieter, blended in a little better, every door would magically open for them. And many white Americans, even those who considered themselves not racist, had been lulled into believing that the system was already fair, that anyone who failed, anyone who faced discrimination, anyone who was crushed, must simply not have worked hard enough. But Amara knew better. That belief was no more than a bright coat of paint covering a rotten frame. America could build golden-domed capitals, could inscribe promises of equality into its Constitution, could hang posters of unity on every street corner. Yet racism, rooted deeper than any visible scar, still lived on, no longer through the open whip but through structures and mindsets, in hiring decisions, in silent judgments, in the invisible thresholds that demanded people of color step back rather than forward. Kyle was merely the tip of that vast submerged iceberg. His downfall, though worth celebrating, was no more than pulling out a single thorn, while an entire poisoned forest remained, dense and stubborn. Amara tightened the strap of her backpack across her shoulder, letting the morning's cold seep into her skin as a reminder. The road ahead was still long. She harbored no illusion that a single arrest, a single trial, or even a single loud victory could erase centuries of injustice built and maintained with such careful hands. But she also knew real change, though agonizingly slow, had begun, not through grand speeches, but through glances changed, hearts awakened, and children growing up to understand that human dignity needs no permission, and true justice knows no color. And for that, Amara Lewis would keep walking, quietly, steadfastly. She would not let small victories breed complacency, nor allow hardships to extinguish the fire inside her, because she understood. In this America, fighting for justice was not just an act, it was a way of existing. Inside the hastily arranged press conference, Lieutenant Davis announced the charges leveled against Kyle Reddick and the Sovereign Guard: conspiracy to incite a riot, domestic terrorism, abuse of authority, and incitement of racial hatred. The punishment facing Kyle went far beyond the loss of his badge. He now faced years behind bars, alongside a permanent stain on his record and on the history of Brookdale. The others, the man who drove the gas-laden truck, the one who sprayed slurs across innocent homes, the one carrying bottles filled with homemade gasoline bombs, were led away in handcuffs, facing federal prison sentences for acts of domestic terrorism. That afternoon, Amara Lewis walked slowly through the familiar streets, past the Gomez family's grocery store, its lights still warm and welcoming, past the small church where bells still chimed their weary song, past homes where families who once greeted her with cold suspicion now offered quiet, awkward, but genuine hellos. No one had forgotten that it was Amara, once an outsider under wary gazes, who had stepped into danger to shield them from a darkness they had, in some way, allowed to take root. Amara wasn't seeking praise. She didn't linger on the grateful looks cast her way. She moved forward quietly, each step carrying with it a fragile, tentative piece of trust, slow, delicate, but real. And under the soft pink-orange hues of the evening sky beneath the fluttering American flag strung from low rooftops, Amara Lewis understood. Some battles would never truly end, but some victories could never be stolen either. For once, a light is lit within people's hearts. It is a flame that no darkness can ever fully extinguish. That evening, as Amara returned home, she found a small envelope lying silently at her doorstep, placed there by an unseen hand, not delivered through any official channel. No sender's name, just 2 handwritten words: "Please read." She bent down, fingertips brushing the rough paper, and opened it. Inside was a short letter, the handwriting strong but trembling, as if written through inner turmoil. "Amara, I am Noah Reddick. Perhaps you remember me, the man you saved amidst the gunfire in Kunduz. I once believed no one could pull me back from death's edge, and then you appeared, not caring who I was, only that I was a human being who needed help. I can never fully express my gratitude. But today, learning that my brother Kyle treated you with a hatred I cannot fathom, my heart is broken. I am sorry, not just for Kyle's actions, but for a system that allowed him to believe it was acceptable. I know this apology is too little, too late. But if you allow me to ask, what can I do to begin making this right?" Amara sat down, her eyes gliding over the words, feeling an emotion that wasn't quite anger, wasn't entirely sorrow. It was something deeper, quieter, a stillness after a storm. She picked up a pen and wrote her reply with the plain, unyielding honesty she had always carried within her heart. "Noah, you are not the one who needs to apologize. What I did in Afghanistan, I did not because of skin color, nationality, or creed. I did it because you were a human being who needed saving. Just as here in Brookdale, I didn't fight to prove my worth. I fought to protect the belief that every life in this country, regardless of where they come from or what color they are, is deserving of safety and dignity. You asked what you can do? Don't let your gratitude end with a letter. Let it become a commitment to defend human rights, to stand for an America worthy of the ideals the world once admired. Let it remind us that America's greatness lies not in its wealth or its power, but in its belief in human dignity, freedom, and justice. Never forget that, even if those around you seem to have lost their way. Amara Lewis. As Amara sealed the envelope, a weight in her heart eased, if only a little. She understood the true victory wasn't about defeating enemies. It was about planting seeds of hope in the hearts still capable of remorse, about nurturing the vision of a better America, one worthy of the ideals she had grown up believing in and had fought her entire life to defend. In the days following the failed riot, Brookdale wore a strange air, like a town gingerly stepping across thin ice. Conversations at coffee shops grew cautious. Glances exchanged on the sidewalks were tinged with hesitation. One part fragile hope, one part lingering fear. Amara Lewis understood this. Real change never arrived overnight after a confrontation. It wasn't a miracle born from a single victory. It was a long, grueling journey requiring patience, courage, and above all, a foundation sturdy enough to heal the fractures that ran deep into the town's roots. For Amara, that foundation was education. In the small auditorium of Brookdale's community center, once used for cooking classes and charity fairs, Amara stood before a whiteboard, a marker in her hand, surveying the sparse group before her. A handful of young officers, a few town residents, and even a couple of high school students gathered for the kickoff of a program she had spent weeks building, bias-free policing. The banner outside was simple, printed in plain blue lettering, but to Amara it read like a declaration. If you want to change how a community acts, you must first change how it sees. Her voice, steady and warm, broke the quiet. "We are here today," she said, her gaze sweeping across the small audience, not to assign blame, not to dwell on the failures of the past. "We are here for the future, for a Brookdale where everyone, regardless of skin color, background, or belief, is first and foremost seen as a human being." She paused, letting the words sink in, like seeds settling into a waiting earth. Amara's first session wasn't dry theory. She presented real-world cases, instances where unconscious bias, a fleeting glance, a silent assumption, had triggered tragedy. She spoke of being pulled over because she didn't fit the area, of watching white colleagues receive trust she was denied, all invisible weights no one wanted to admit existed. And then she showed how the first reaction, a glance, a question, a posture, could mean the difference between peace and escalation. Gradually, guarded eyes grew attentive. Tentative questions turned into honest dialogue. Young officers, who had entered with crossed arms, began uncrossing them, jotting notes, asking questions with an openness that hadn't been there before. Amara saw it, the flicker of curiosity, the spark of willingness, and she knew this was how change began. Not from top-down orders, but within each heart, each small awakening of awareness. Beyond this first meeting, Amara, Lieutenant Davis, and a few committed community members launched a broader initiative, Brookdale for All. The campaign offered town-wide seminars for shop owners, teachers, and students on the history of racial discrimination, on how unconscious bias works, and how a community could dismantle it together. Amara pushed for citizenship education in schools, teaching the younger generation not just patriotism, but their role in forging a fair society. She helped organize movie nights and storytelling sessions, bridging generations and backgrounds, to help Brookdale's youth understand that the America they loved was only truly great when it dared to confront its scars. And small miracles began to bloom. Children once taught that different meant danger, but now listened to stories of friendship across color lines. Young officers once taught that suspicion is survival, but now practice listening first, judging later. Brookdale, the same town of maple-lined streets, family diners with fluttering American flags, was learning a new heartbeat, slow, fragile, but persistent, like the steady thrum of Amara Lewis's own resilient heart. One afternoon, as she packed away papers after a workshop, Amara found a small note tucked into her bag. Written simply, in uneven handwriting, it said, "You made me believe I could be part of something good." Amara smiled, not brightly, not triumphantly, but peacefully, like sunlight breaking gently through after a long rain. True change was never easy, but with every eye that lit up with understanding, every hand extended instead of withdrawn, Amara knew she had begun to kindle something bigger than fear. A new Brookdale, an America worthy of its most sacred promises: freedom, equality, justice for all. Brookdale's seasons drifted by in slow, patient rhythms. Along the sidewalks that once bore the heavy weight of suspicion, new colors began to bloom, not just on porches draped in flags or windows adorned with Brookdale for all posters, but in the way people greeted each other on the streets, in the glances exchanged between officers and citizens, in the laughter of children racing down gravel paths. Amara Lewis became part of that current, not dazzling, not loud, but steadfast, like an underground stream nourishing the fields after a long drought. She taught her bias-free policing classes with the same quiet regularity as breathing. She attended community fairs, telling children stories about courage, about kindness that transcended skin color, about an America that was not just a symbol on faded posters, but a living belief reflected in every small action. Each time, she caught the glimmer of realization in a young officer's eyes, the moment they understood that power was meant to protect, not oppress, or saw a child of color raise their hand confidently in a town hall without fear of judgment. Amara knew she was winning, not through fanfare or applause, but with victories deeper and quieter than any she had won on a battlefield. No one in Brookdale hailed her as a hero. She never sought it. Her victory was her existence itself, walking tall each day through the town, asking for no permission, offering no apology, never lowering herself to fit into anyone's narrow mold. The call for a classified mission arrived on a crisp, early winter afternoon, when the last leaves had fallen from the weathered maple tree outside her house. A simple letter, stamped with the red insignia of the Central Intelligence Agency. No explanations. Just orders to depart within 48 hours, prepared for an operation that required absolute discretion and loyalty. Amara sat by her window for hours after reading it, gazing out at rooftops cloaked in mist. She felt no regret. Soldiers like her were made to move, to carry light into the darkest corners of the world. But a part of her, the part that had found something resembling home after so many years adrift, stirred with a quiet ache. She packed lightly, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned long ago to carry only what was essential. She made no announcements. Brookdale did not need a grand farewell. She sent Lieutenant Davis a brief message. "Thank you. Keep fighting for what's right." That evening, as she wheeled her small suitcase onto the porch, she froze. Before her stood the entire neighborhood, not with banners or music, but with honest faces and steady, quiet eyes. The Carters led the way hand in hand, faces radiant with pride. The Johnsons stood nearby, awkward yet resolute, little Savannah waving enthusiastically. Young officers in uniform saluted her with solemn respect. A small but unwavering line had formed along the driveway, a silent corridor of honor for a woman they owed more than words could express. Amara walked slowly through them, each step carving something indelible into the very ground of Brookdale. As she neared, Carter stepped forward. The white-haired man, who had once hidden behind shame, now gripped her hands tightly, eyes glistening. "You changed this place, Amara," he said hoarsely. "You changed us. Thank you." Amara smiled, a quiet smile as soft as sunlight warming frozen earth. "Don't thank me," she said. "Thank yourselves for choosing the harder road, the right one." She knelt to hug Savannah, who clung stubbornly to her leg and whispered into the girl's ear, "Always believe in kindness, Savannah. And remember, one person, just one, can make a difference." As Amara boarded the car, the crowd remained silent, holding the moment together as though afraid that even a single loud goodbye might shatter it. The car rolled slowly through the familiar streets, past white fences, crooked porches, and warmly lit windows. Amara did not look back. She didn't need to. She knew the greatest victory was not in medals or speeches. It was in the simple, undeniable act of existing, proud and unyielding in the hearts she had touched. And somewhere in the deepening night, trailing behind the car's taillights, Amara Lewis smiled, knowing that the flame she had lit would never be extinguished, because it had already been passed on to stronger hands, to dreams now soaring far beyond the fences built by fear and hate. Amara Lewis departed in silence, but her footprints remained etched in every corner of Brookdale, a place where courage rekindled faith, where human dignity was elevated above all prejudice. She did not conquer through force, but through quiet persistence, through her unwavering belief in an America worthy of the highest ideals it once promised. Have you ever met someone, perhaps through a single, seemingly small action, who made the world around you a better place? Share your story in the comments below. If Amara's journey touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that the flames of hope and justice may continue to spread, illuminating even the darkest places once swallowed by despair.